Oh. Here we go. I think we'll get started. Thank you to the community members that are here. I'd like to acknowledge the land that we meet on tonight is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So we are currently doing a council briefing session. Is it live streamed? Thank you. Good evening to the people who are watching online. I don't have a sheet. I don't have a sheet in front of me, so we don't make decisions or consensus decisions. And if people can turn their microphone, turn their phones off, or if they need to take a phone call, take it outside, please. I don't think we'll be going into confidence. There won't be any need for that. I haven't been advised that there will be a need for that. So I'll hand over to the consultants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're very pleased to be here tonight. I'm Sue Phillips from Phillips Pilkington Architect, and with me is my colleague Tom Hamper, a senior architect in our practice and an associate. This has been a wonderful project for us to work on. It's been a real learning experience about the fascinating history of the Willaston Cemetery. We're going to give a brief presentation and leave some time for questions, we hope, at the end. The presentation will give you a little bit of background on our process and some of the historical research that we've undertaken, and talk a little bit at the beginning about what a conservation management plan actually is. And then we'll discuss our recommendations and an overview of the policies that we've developed, the next steps, and then an opportunity for questions at the end. I'm just going to hand over briefly to Tom for an acknowledgement of country.
Sure, thanks, Sue. I guess reiterating your own acknowledgement that we're here on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, discussing a site that is also on their traditional lands. And I guess we'd also like to add that, a lot of the focus of what we'll talk about is largely on the colonial history of the site. We hope that this presentation and discussion is sort of approached in the spirit of custodianship, which is at the core of First Nations people's relationship with the land, but also, a fundamental principle of, more modern heritage conservation practices.
So it is a conservation management plan. It's probably a sort of obvious answer, but at its simplest form, it's a document which sets out what is significant about a place and consequently what policies are appropriate to enable the significance to be retained in its future uses and development. And a big part of what we've prepared is a series of policies to guide development into the future and also to preserve what is there. The Conservation Management Plan establishes principles and guidelines for the management plan I should have said there are established principles and guidelines for the preparation of conservation management plans, which include cemeteries. We've prepared this plan with quite a large consultant team. Some of them are in the room tonight. Adrian Shackley is our historian who provided invaluable advice on the history of the cemetery. We also had as part of our team Richard Woods of Habitable Places, Stevens Architects who have expertise in cemeteries and their preservation, Taylor Cullity Lethleen, Landscape Architects, because it is essentially a landscape rather than a building, and the setting of the cemetery, we're keen to have that landscape perspective. CPR, civil engineers, because stormwater issues and how they're managed are very critical in terms of the ongoing preservation of the cemetery. Stone Initiatives, who are experts in stone identification and conservation policies because of the many monuments within the cemetery and gravestones that need to be preserved, and Peter Tucker, an environmental consultant, because a key part of the cemetery is the perimeter vegetation around it. In preparing the conservation management plan, the key steps that we have undertaken to understand the place, and that's understanding its history, the physical evidence that is there, and consultation, which has been both with Council and the Friends of Willaston Cemetery. We then assess the significance based on established criteria and accepted definitions, and develop policies addressing specific issues related to the site. We consider management, conservation, control of change, and care of fabric, setting and interpretation. And the documents illustrated on the slide up there are just some of the documents that guide the development of a conservation plan. The first two are prepared by ICOMOS Australia, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, and since 1976, Australia ICOMOS has been committed to improving conservation philosophy and practice for culturally significant sites. The next document was prepared by McDougall and Vines back in 2004, and McDougall and Vines prepared the first conservation and management plan for the cemetery back in 2004. And then there are the guidelines for interpreting state heritage criteria, which is a document published by Heritage SA and approved by the South Australian Heritage Council. In terms of our process, which I've touched on, consultation, understanding the importance of this place to the local community is a key part of what we've been doing, understanding all the issues in terms of maintaining the infrastructure there and the management of the cemetery, so close consultation with Council, with the Friends of Willaston Cemetery. And also there's been another project that impacts on the cemetery, the entry project. So we've had a number of consultations with Council and SMFA, the architects leading that entry project. In terms of research, we've reviewed the previous conservation management plans, the McDougall and Vines plan of 2003 and the plan prepared by Council in 2014, which we understand was never formally adopted. We've consulted with Heritage SA, we've looked at primary source material, titles and historical information, newspaper articles. We've also looked at their primary sources. We've looked at sources such as Robert Nichols' book entitled The End of the Road, Government, Society and the Disposal of Human Remains in the 19th and 20th century. We've also looked or learnt from other cemeteries and practices there, including West Terrace and Cheltenham, and then we've undertaken a lot of site investigations, condition assessments, and our specialist consultants have contributed to that and included in the conservation and management plan their reports as appendices, but we've sort of summarised them in the main body of the text, looking at stone analysis, and I think it's Jim Mann investigating one of the gravestones in the picture on the bottom left-hand side. We've looked at the remnant native vegetation, the landscape, and we've also been out to the council depot to just have a look at things that have formerly been in the cemetery that have found their way into the depot. I'd now like to just talk about the some of the key issues that have come up in the consultation. So we've had a number of meetings, and issues that have been raised include the importance of the cemetery as a community asset in terms of its family and historic connections, also used for recreation. It's of great interest for visitors to the region coming to explore the cemetery. Another issue that came up was the 2003 CMP defined significant sites within the cemetery, and the question is significant to who? So there's a that was an issue raised particularly by the Friends of Willaston Cemetery. It is a defined area, and the capacity of the cemetery to be able to continue to accommodate new burials was a key issue. The remnant vegetation around the cemetery is a key part of its significance, and it has been unfortunately deteriorating, so how we can address that. The issue of the impact of the sugar gums on that remnant vegetation, issues of amenity, things like shade, access to toilets and amenities, seating and so on, finding your way around the cemetery, wayfinding and signage, the stormwater management, and council's been involved in quite a lot of work to address that in the recent past. The entry project will have a big impact on people's perceptions coming into the cemetery, the fact sheets that are being finalised, and then the process of approvals and the role of Heritage SA, car parking and access, and the impact of rising salt on both the remnant vegetation, the trees within the formal area of the cemetery, and the grave sites themselves. I'll now pass over to Tom, who'll talk a little bit about site investigations, the historical research we've undertaken, the key recommendations, and a brief overview of the policies, and then we'll have some time for questions.
So I'll sort of talk through, I guess, the research and site analysis that we've undertaken. In terms of on-site investigations and analysis, particularly around the historic elements of the cemetery, the key things, it's fairly self-explanatory, I suppose. The key things we've looked at, the monumentation on site. There's obviously quite a significant collection of historic grave sites and monuments that go back right to the establishment of the cemetery in 1866, and lots of fantastic examples of the materials of the time, the craftsmanship of the time, representations of the I guess techniques that were used, and the people that did the work as well. So that also relates to the ironwork on site. Obviously, the cast iron industry was significant in the development of Gawler, and there's some fantastic examples of local cast iron work on the site, and really one of the key elements of the significance of the site is that, or the monumentation, but also the examples of ironwork. As Sue mentioned, Stone Initiatives did some detailed investigation on site. So the photo there was them on site with a magnifying glass, looking very, very closely at some of the stonework. So that was on the previous slide, but some of these images are from their report as well. Their report is included as an appendix in our CMP, so all that information is there, but a fantastic, some of the key elements of their report were the wide range of stone that was used on the site, and some examples of kind of unusual stone that was used on site. including some sandstone from Scotland, some sandstone that they, well, I think they thought was from New Zealand as well, but also their report illustrates the materials that were used on site and their relationship to the development of industry and craft and in the early days of the colony. The other sort of significant bit of fabric on site is the main entry gates. So we know that they were imported, or the posts at least were imported from Scotland, and they're obviously a key feature of the site and the approach to the site. Some of the site analysis that we looked at in terms of the landscape, the layout and the planning of the cemetery is one of the key features of its significance, and the fact that it still maintains most of that layout today is important. So some of the key features identified there, the main roadways and pathways, so the north, south and east-west pathways, and the secondary east-west pathways and the diagonal roadways around the outside. The outer vegetation reserve was a key part of the planning of the cemetery. The various entry points into the cemetery, and we might talk a little bit more about that further on. And the kind of the key activity points in the cemetery. So the main entry would have been the first one of those, but then also the central circular space where the columbarium is now located, being another key focal point within the site. So some of the key issues in terms of landscape, the paths and roadway, like I said, the historic layout of the cemetery is critical to its significance. The avenue planting that's been established on the site, so along the main north-south roadway, there's the pine, I think Italian cypress pine trees that have been planted. There's also the sugar gums around the outside of the outer roadway, which again we'll talk a bit more about, I'm sure, but they do add to the setting of the cemetery and the amenity in terms of shade and shelter. The stormwater management and infrastructure on the site, which the council has done a lot of work on in sort of the last 20 or so years, developing that, which has been important in managing water on the site. But there are some sort of further considerations, I guess, that should be looked at. There's quite a bit of rubble pathways on the site. Again, there's some recommendations around that in terms of future maintenance and in considering what materials are used on the site. The central columbarium as a key focus point of the site is another key area to look at, and we talked about amenities on site, so signage, bins, shade, seating, and wayfinding as well. And at the moment, I think there's a bit of a lack of a cohesive strategy in addressing some of those issues, which we hope our report helps address. The remnant vegetation around the outside of the site is a outcome of the original planning of the site. So we know that when the cemetery was originally granted to the council, it was established with a central burial area and an outer, I think the notation on the survey was shrubbery reserve. So the intention from the beginning was that this was a landscape area of some sort, and luckily it's survived or largely survived intact until today. As Sue mentioned, we had a specialist environmental consultant, Peter Tucker, engaged on this project, who put together a detailed report on the condition of the remnant vegetation, which is also included as an appendix in the report. I've listed here some of the key findings from his report. I guess the main thing that he's noted is that the remnant vegetation is generally in pretty good condition, all things considered, and critically, in his view, has a high capacity for regeneration. So if the right steps are taken, if the right plans are put in place, from his point of view, there's a good hope for the future of this area. He did note significant signs of stress, though, in the area. So the malleebox and native pine trees, which are the endemic trees in the area, by his calculations, 40% of those trees on site were dead, and there were signs of stress in others. The site is home to 22 regionally threatened plant species, including vulnerable and rare and near threatened plants. And I think that number has been greater in the past in earlier surveys, but the current status is that there's 22 of those plants left. The sugar gums, again, are having a detrimental impact on the remnant vegetation, and there's also some other non-native, non-endemic trees in there that are also contributing to some of that stress on the site. Weeds are an ongoing issue for the site, and he did note that there's the possibility of possibly reintroducing some cultural burning practices on the site, which may be a controversial or might be seen as high risk, but we think is worth at least investigating as an option, given the impact it could have in assisting the regeneration of the site. So the next few slides are looking at the titles specifically on the site, and the reason that we see this as important is because currently there are 3 titles over the site. So there's a central title, which is Crown Reserve. There's a middle ring, which is section 463, which is the council currently has the certificate of title over that section. And then there's another outer ring, which is Crown Reserve. This was identified in the 2003 report as well, and there was kind of some confusion and speculation about why there were 3 titles, and there wasn't really any good answer to that, and there wasn't really any good answer to why 2 of them were Crown land and 1 of them was owned by the council. So we thought we'd try and get to the bottom of that, which we think we have. So the original survey for the area, which is the 1858 survey, which I believe was Goyder, or led by Goyder, shows the cemetery site on that survey. It shows the central cemetery square and an outer blue kind of highlighted area, which is the shrubbery reserve. But there are also some markings on there that are in red pen, which we now believe or understand to have been later markings on the plan. The other part to this is we know that the title was handed to council in 1942, or the title was created in 1942. And so we believe, which is the title on the document on the bottom right there, is the survey plan, and the top right is the actual title, original title. We think that the red markings on the original survey plan were done in 1942 when that title was created. The other sort of bit of evidence, I guess, is the original plan of the cemetery that I believe is in the council's possession still, which was made in 1864, shows the central cemetery area surrounded by a single kind of reserve area on the outside. And there are a number of other markings on the plan, which are in pen and pencil, and a variety of different styles, which again we think were later additions. And you can see, well, you can kind of understand that they're later additions because the bottom, I don't know if this has a pointer function, maybe not, but the bottom right-hand plan shows the grave plots that were marked out in the middle reserve section, which can't have been done before the council owned that bit of land. So there's kind of a good trail of evidence that was the case. I guess the reason this is kind of important is that it shows that the original plan of the cemetery followed a kind of pattern that was established. Well, it was kind of a template pattern really, but it had the central cemetery surrounded by a single reserve of land, which then was used on other cemeteries in South Australia. It also kind of illustrates the history of the development of the site. The council, I think in their 30s or 40s, became concerned that the cemetery was reaching capacity. They reached out to the state government to try and get some more land, and there was a process there that led to them getting this title and clearing the southwest and southeastern sections of the vegetation reserve, which was kind of in some ways a little bit unfortunate for that reserve, but that's history now, I suppose. The main thing is that we kind of protect what we've got left. Another key bit of research, and Adrian was really important in helping us with a lot of this as well, trawling through historical newspaper articles and finding bits of relevant information. So these newspaper articles go right back to even before the cemetery was established, and right up to sort of the current day, with the Precious Souls Memorial being unveiled. So this is just a small selection of clippings. There are hundreds more, and a really critical resource for us in terms of understanding the development of the site, the key issues that have influenced the site that have been discussed by the community and the council throughout the history of the cemetery. And also, one of the things that Adrian was keen to point out was the patterns of landscape management as well on the site in terms of the, particularly the sugar gums on the site and how they were seen as a resource, as well as how they were managed through the history of the site. The other sort of key bit of research that Adrian's been able to help us out with is the significance of the cemetery in terms of the development of other cemeteries in South Australia. There's historical records that the Surveyor General at the time, who I can't remember the name of, Freeling, when he was asked about giving the Gawler Council land for a cemetery, suggested that it should be a central reserve surrounded by a belt of bushland, and that's then gone on to become the template for other cemeteries, such as in Narracourt, which is the diagram there, Blanchetown, Kalunga, Halbury, Moonta, Wallaroo, Kadina, and I'm sure many more. There's also a relationship there with Goyder's model towns that were also later established in South Australia. So I guess before I go on to the key recommendations, what we've been attempting to do, I guess, with this background information is paint the picture of the significance of the cemetery, the importance to the community, the historical material that's on the site and its cultural value, the sort of place of the cemetery within the broader history of Gawler and South Australia, and I guess trying to demonstrate its significance. So I guess the key part of the report really is the recommendations and the policies that we've put together. The key kind of core priorities that we've identified on the cemetery, we've identified three things. And it kind of really follows the layout of the cemetery in some ways. The conservation of the historic fabric of the cemetery is critical to maintaining the cultural and historical links with the cemetery. The landscape, really, point two is really about the landscape, so the planning and the layout of the cemetery is the other key bit of significance. And the third part is the outer vegetation, the remnant vegetation on the site. So all of the policies that we've outlined in our report support those key priorities. There are a few recommendations that we think are the most critical. The site really needs a master plan to guide future development, while our report provides some guidelines, I guess, for that future conservation and development. The details of how that occurs should be laid out in a master plan, and that master plan should be reviewed frequently into the future. The sugar gums should be removed from the site, with a priority on the sugar gums in the remnant vegetation area. It should be a gradual process. We're not suggesting that they're all clear felled overnight, and there'll be some consultation and education that needs to happen around that with the community, which we recognise. But in terms of the health of that remnant vegetation particularly, that's going to be important. The issue of significance or significant grave sites on the site is another one that is going to be critical in terms of how reuse is managed of some of those sites and how their maintenance and conservation is dealt with in the future. Engagement with the local Kaurna community as well is, we think, will be important in establishing their, I guess, thoughts about how or whether even any recognition should be established on the site. The cemetery, there should be no further expansion of the cemetery into the remnant vegetation. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but important to outline, and that the management of the cemetery should remain with council. We don't think there's any plans for it to be otherwise, but the council plays a key role in the continuing engagement with the community and volunteer groups as well. Okay, we're going okay for time. We won't go through every single policy that we've outlined, otherwise we'll be here all night. But we thought we would identify just a few just to talk through those in a little bit more detail. As we've provided sort of the three core priority areas for the cemetery, we've divided up the policies into relevant sections. So the first section is around policies to do with the historic fabric on the cemetery. The one we've pulled out here is policy number 2. So maintain the historical added cemetery roadways, paths and burial plots, ensure that any new work within the cemetery and any new burials conforms to the distinctive original diamond-shaped plan. And so that plan is on the right-hand side there. To the council's credit, this has been something that they have done with the works they've done on site in terms of maintaining the widths of the roadways and paths, that this policy will ensure that that continues into the future. There's kind of important historical acknowledgement there as well in terms of the way the cemetery was laid out with a chain kind of base dimension. The main roadways are half a chain wide, which is 33 feet. The secondary roadways are, I think, a third of a chain wide. So there's some important context there to maintain into the future. The other one that we wanted to touch on was policy 13, preserve and retain the main entrance as the primary entrance for visitors as an important part of the historic fabric of the cemetery. That obviously refers to the main gateway into the site, so it's important historic fabric in terms of the ironwork, the cast iron posts and gates and fence. Conservation of that is important to maintaining the significance of the site, but there's also it's also important to consider the landscape setting around the main entryway. So the diagram on the right there was something that we worked on when we were discussing the implications of the entry gateway project that the council are working on at the moment. So we think that the landscape should be sympathetic to the gates that are there at the moment, but it should also reflect the formal layout of the cemetery beyond. It should set the scene for visitors as they arrive to the cemetery, the planting and the materials and the way the site is accessed is going to be important into the future for the cemetery. The next sort of section of policies that we've got there are around the landscape. The policy we've highlighted, policy 22, no new sugar gums are to be planted on the site, including in the historic cemetery area. New trees should be either endemic to the site or carefully selected to mitigate impacts on the cemetery and native vegetation. So, I guess it's important to note that the sugar gums are important to the setting of the cemetery. They provide a backdrop to the kind of historic core of the cemetery. They provide shade, they provide habitat, they provide canopy cover. At the same time, they've got some issues, and there is opportunity to, where the sugar gums are missing from the southeastern side of the site, establish a new pattern for planting on the site. So TCL have provided some suggestions about what species might be more appropriate. But the first step would be establishing that pattern, and then as the other sugar gums are, as they die off or as they're removed, they can be replaced with the same plants. And I guess we see it as an opportunity as well to strengthen that sort of key element of the cemetery. The last one, or the last section of policies that we've got are related to the remnant vegetation. The photos on the right are both taken, I should have mentioned as well on the slide previously on the remnant vegetation, that all those photos were taken on the site. Who was the... Belinda Copeland was the photographer, and some just amazing photos, I think. So the top one is a jumping spider that she's identified on the site, and the bottom one is a fairy wren, I suppose. Yeah, which I think is just beautiful. So, and just highlights, I guess, the importance of that habitat for all creatures, great and small. So, in that respect, Policy 27, no works should be undertaken at Willaston Cemetery without consideration of the impacts on the surrounding native vegetation reserve. This includes landscape works, planting, civil works, stormwater management and construction of new structures. An example of that is the stormwater works that have been undertaken on the site. So dealing with the drainage on the site has obviously improved the conditions within the cemetery, but there have been some perhaps unforeseen impacts on the remnant vegetation. Some of that water has been diverted into the sort of remnant vegetation zone. There are a couple of stormwater outlets that have caused some issues around them. And so we'd hope that, in the future, projects or similar projects would take into consideration from the start the potential impacts on the remnant vegetation. I mean, an example of that might be possible works to Cemetery Road. If that's bitumised, there's going to be stormwater issues there. There's going to be, spoil to manage, and we'd hope that that's done in a way that's sensitive to the site. So that's the policies part. The next part is kind of next steps. The draft report that we submitted last week is largely completed, but like most things, there's always some tweaking that can occur. We've, I guess, already had some feedback on some of those things. We recognise that there's some editing to do. There's probably many more typos than we'd like to think within the report. We'd like to deal with those. Things like text sizes as well that we can improve. The other thing is that there are a few topics that we'd also like to develop a little bit further within the report. Importantly though, emphasising that none of these, I guess, additional bits of information or further discussion would change any of the policies or recommendations within the report. It's largely about providing a little bit more background within the report. So the next step, we understand, is a community consultation process, which Andrew has briefed us on. The dates that he's suggested, 19th of August to the 10th of September for that consultation period. I believe there may be some questions around that later, but we can answer those in a minute. The other suggestion was having a sort of community forum Q&A session during that public consultation period, which we're happy to facilitate. The date suggested was 2nd September, and there's also, I guess, a need for the development of sort of promotional, informational material for the community, which we'll work with the council on developing. There's a quick mock-up there for what that might look like in terms of promoting the draft report to the community. And that's it. Thank you.
So, opportunities
And
for questions.
Yes, yes. Councillor Koch, I saw your hand up first.
A couple of questions, thank you.
Yes.
The first one, I'm looking at policy 24, and it talks about opportunity to plant native and endemic plantings within the historical cemetery area. So I suppose that's the core area. And you did talk about there was Italian cypresses that wasn't finished as an avenue. It's fine. I'm just wondering if things like calitris or exocarpus, the native cherry, would potentially be suitable for those, because they can be formed up. So that was my first question. The other one is that when I look at the site, there's a whole lot of little triangular bits, spare bits throughout the area. Is there opportunities to do some landscaping there, say with native grasses or some of the smaller species that might be crowded out in the remnant vegetation? So that's my first question.
Yes. So in terms of the avenue planting, definitely there are opportunities there, we think, for potentially the native cypress or the calitris, to be used. So at the TCL have sort of, I guess, suggested that as a possibility as well. The other one, the triangular little bits of space that are left over at the end of the rows, again, yes, that's something that was identified when we were doing some of that more detailed site analysis. And so in the interest of trying to keep the presentation reasonably condensed, underneath all of these policies in the draft report, if you read through that, we've provided recommendations for how the policies might be implemented. So I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what we had under Policy 24, but that would be where we can provide some of that extra detail about opportunities. Yeah.
Can I just say, which is not quite in response to that question, but that Peter Tucker has said in terms of revegetation within the perimeter endemic species, that ideally it should be from seed collected on site rather than introducing plants that are the right species but may have sort of different variant that then takes over and impacts on what's there. So the planting, I guess restoration, needs to be carefully managed to preserve the importance of that native vegetation.
Next question.
The next one was about, you made a comment about rising salt in the central part of the cemetery. How bad is that, and is that affected by the sulphides from the blue metal?
We didn't have any detailed reports about the rising salt, and that wasn't, I guess, part of our consultant team's brief. So the issue of the salt was something that came up during the consultation with the council. Yeah. I think mainly in relation to the Aleppo pines that were on the site that were affected, or apparently affected by the salt, the rising salt. Stone Initiatives, though, in their report did identify or did recommend not using dolomite or the blue metal on site because the sulphides might create issues for some of the stone work.
Yeah. I might go to Janine, who's the chair of the Friends of the Willaston Cemetery. Do you have any comments to make?
Thank you. I must be the shortest person here. There are a couple of things that I wanted to just bring up. Firstly, very impressed with your methodology and the thoroughness of your report. I thought that was quite good. One of the issues was I'd like to respectfully ask that we delay the community engagement period and make it a longer period, only because that there are many people outside of Gawler and South Australia, in fact countrywide, of people who have ancestors buried in the Willaston Cemetery, and I'd like to have the time to be able to get hold of all of those people so that they can respond to this. So that was one of them. The other one is about the timeline for the 35 recommendations. Will there be timelines about implementing those? Specifically, when I'm talking to also is Policy 7, which has been on the Friends of the Willaston Cemetery's agenda for a long time, and that's the fact sheets that we've been developing for many years. And you have suggested that they be done as soon as possible, so we would like a timeline to get them out fairly quickly. Other than that, there's just a bit of things about proofreading and stuff, but I think they've been dealt with already, so that was all really we had to say on that, but
Patricia,
congratulations, well done.
Patricia, do you want to say any words? Do you want to make any comment? Thank you, Janine.
Hi, Patricia Dent. My concern is the area of the Precious Souls Memorial and the Del Cooper Baby Cemetery area. Yeah. At the moment, it's very daggy and it needs a lot of work done on it. So we have Alec Chapman and I, who put this together in the beginning, are organising a fundraiser to do some fundraising to raise money so that we can actually improve it. And the area has been outgrown. We've got most of our, I think, Megan, most of the leaves are gone. and we need to add for the future. So we need to build the bricks up and finish off the whole thing and make sure it does look like a proper area for reflection, because at the moment it is not very reflective at all. So we're in the process. In October, we're having a big fundraiser, but we also need to look for the future that council actually puts this in the budget, because it's been looked after by the guys quite well, but it's a big thing. So if we're going to have this go on, and I won't be around, but it needs to be looked at. So it's 15 years next year, and we would like to have that finished, and we would like to have a nice memorial celebration. So it's something that it needs to be included and needs to be looked at clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Any other questions, Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I had a very nerdy history question. So you mentioned that in the 40s it came into the ownership of the council. Was that right?
So the middle ring of the three titles was, the title was created in 1942, and then that title was given to the council for essentially for the expansion of the burial area on the site.
Yep.
Yeah,
Another question?
Yeah, I was just curious because I think, am I correct that the area only came into the Gawler Council in the 30s, and before that it was part of the Muddlawira Council? I'm just wondering if there was any. Sorry.
Adrian might be able to.
Yes, up to 1933 it was in Muddlawira Council, but the setting aside of the Crown land for the cemetery was to the town of Gawler, although if you have a look through the documentation, originally they were proposing a joint arrangement between Gawler and Muddlawira, but that didn't effectively happen. It's a bit confusing actually as to what happened back then. There's no proper record of the dedication of the Crown land. It was just this documentation to the council. And the setup was quite unusual. All of the cemeteries created after, Willaston was the first one with this model. All the ones created afterwards had the central square as land owned by the council and the surrounding Crown land as Crown land. Gawler Willaston Cemetery is completely different. But, you know, that was the model they set up, but they didn't quite carry it through.
Thank you, Adrian. Any other questions, Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Through the documentation, it talks about the importance of the monuments and how there's degradation, etc., etc. Who's responsible for maintaining them, and who pays for that? It just seems something I just want to be clear in my mind.
Yeah, it's a good question, and probably the crux of the issue is around, I guess, the identification. First of all, the identification of what's significant or historical, and then from there, kind of flows on, I guess, whether there's an established ownership of that site or lease on the site, and if not, then does the council take responsibility for that site? Does it release the site and maintain the monumentation on the site with a new memorial to whoever the new interment is? There's a whole lot of issues that come out of that aren't, there's no easy answers to. So I guess, and I think that there's a whole nother process that needs to happen to work through that. So it's one of the recommendations in our report is that does happen, that there are some precedents. For example, West Terrace Cemetery cemeteries everywhere are dealing with the same issue, right? West Terrace Cemetery have decided not to acknowledge significance. They've got space still, though, to expand into, so they're not having the issue of necessarily reusing, but there's still issues around leases expiring and then who's responsible for maintenance and sort of thing. Cheltenham Cemetery is another one that I think have a slightly different approach. But there needs to be a whole lot more consultation and understanding the precedents and the specifics as well of Willaston Cemetery. And then I guess you can look at, are heritage grants available for some of that work? How do the Friends get involved with some of that work? And how does the community provide some of that work? Another issue is skilled tradespeople to be able to do some of that maintenance work that's a bit more involved than just cleaning. There's damp issues of rising damp and splitting headstones that need more skill and training to be able to deal with.
Thank you. Councillor Hennessy?
Thank you, Mayor. If I can add to that, even closer to home, St George's Cemetery is already dealing with that. So we've got some precedent there. It wasn't stressed in the report, but we do have Smithfield Memorial Park within our council. So since 1942, yes, there's been concerns about the capacity of the Willaston Cemetery, but it's become a specialised cemetery in a way. And people who want natural burials or other things, Smithfield is there and is being used as well. So we have many options. And just to reply perhaps to the Deputy Mayor, 1942 was all part of the war planning, and obviously they were planning for war graves, but more importantly they remembered that after the First World War there was a pandemic, and they were trying to make plans to have additional capacity because Gawler was hit by the First World War pandemic, and we have graves in that cemetery from that. So I think for a very long time we've been saying we've been running out of room. There are many different options that we now have, including Smithfield. So, yeah.
Thank you. One more question. Yeah.
From my understanding, there's about 200 sugar gums up there, and that's probably a costly exercise. Is there any clever ways that we can offset the cost of that? For example, I used to work for a tree surgery company, and we used to take down trees, and we used to, high quality trunks we would slab, and we'd make money out of, the timber, to furniture makers, etc. I mean, I'm just wondering if there's any offset that we could do with somebody, firewood, for example, because it's a pretty expensive exercise to take down 200 large trees.
I guess that kind of emphasises another reason to implement something gradually over a long period of time. It's interesting you say that. There's historical precedents at Willaston Cemetery for the very same thing. So I think it was in the 1930s during the Depression they were sort of the reverse. They were chopping them down to sell to let local unemployed townspeople sell the firewood. There's I guess opportunities there.
One more.
But no, it's just a comment. In the arboricultural industry, we're now moving away from just chipping everything.
I'll turn it on.
Yeah, the best value from the timber that we get from if we dismantle a tree, for example. So maybe we should be looking at that as a model to recoup some of the funds, potentially.
Suggest that the sugar gums, while they have had or are continuing to have a detrimental impact on the remnant vegetation, they tell us something about the history and approach to landscape and arboriculture through that era. So I think it would be lovely to have some interpretation which could, in terms of things like possibly the entrance area, but also there's a path network that runs through that remnant vegetation, opportunities to use some portion of the trees to create spots to sit and have a rest as you wander around. So it would be, I think, important for the history of those sugar gums to be interpreted within the overall cemetery. The 2003 Conservation Management Plan wanted to retain them. We have taken a different view after the research that's been done, but the priority is the sugar gums that are in the remnant vegetation. They're the ones that should be focused on first in terms of removal, rather than the ones that are bordering the edge of the cemetery on the southwest and southeast side.
So I might wrap this up because it's 8 o'clock and we're supposed to start a special council meeting at 8 o'clock. So thank you for your presentation, and thank you, Janine and Patricia, for your comments, and thank you for the questions. Thank you very, very much. So we will start. We'll have a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at quarter past. Okay.